The first plenary session is Unified Water Infrastructure Plan, a new process for funding water projects. And let's have a big hand for Isabelle Melmer and Keith Larson.
Hello, my name is Isabelle Melmer, and I will be presenting on the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan, which is, like we said, the new process for water funding projects. And I'm joined here today with Eric Dixon, also with Water Resources, and then Keith Larson is with Bowen, Collins & Associates, and they are part of our consulting group that has assisted in the development of this process. So I'd like to start off this presentation with talking about watersheds in Utah. I'm sure this group is very familiar with this topic. And as we all know, there's a large variety of stakeholders within this state, which includes municipal, which is your county, city, towns, water conservancy districts, and irrigation, or special service districts. And then we have agricultural interests, which is our water companies, canal companies, etc. And then finally, industrial. And oftentimes, a lot of these stakeholders have very diverse interests relating to water. This can include your domestic use, irrigation, recreation, the environment, energy, agriculture, and the economy. And oftentimes, a lot of these interests conflict and contradict each other. So when we have this large variety of stakeholders throughout the state with this very diverse interests over the common need of water, and that can contradict things sometimes. So with this idea of water, I'd like to talk about the water infrastructure in the state and what does the water infrastructure look like this day. So in 2025, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out a report card and grades each infrastructure type based on the condition. And as you can see, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. And then in 2020, Prepare 60 created a report, and Prepare 60 consisted of the 7 largest water conservancy districts in the state, and they came out with a report that estimated the water infrastructure needs by 2060, and that is an estimated $38.2 billion in drinking water infrastructure needs. This study did not evaluate water quality needs, which is your stormwater or wastewater, and that's an additional $15 billion. And then another $6 billion for irrigation and canal projects. So as you can see, the infrastructure need is very large, and in this day and age, project costs are just increasing. And for those municipal entities who have retail end users, increasing rates sometimes isn't enough for these large capital projects. And so we see a funding gap. And then also there is federal fund uncertainty. In 2021, there was a historic investment into water infrastructure with that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But then in 2026, the federal budget proposed to have historic cuts to water funding. It also stated that when it comes to water infrastructure funding, the states should be responsible for funding their own water projects. So that's what this talk is about, is how is the state managing this shift in water funding. So in the 1980s, the Water Development Coordinating Council was created, and their primary job is to collect the agencies that are relevant for dispersing water infrastructure funds. As you can see, this council is made up of the Division of Water Resources, the Division of Water Quality, Drinking Water, Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, Workforce Services, and then a Water Conservancy District representative, which is a recent change through legislation, and the representative is Washington County right now. And then finally, the State Treasurer's Office. So historically, this council has had multiple funding paths with separate application processes through the 3 main divisions, which is your Division of Water Quality, Drinking Water, and Water Resources. And then sporadically, there are direct appropriations from the legislature to these agencies. This siloed funding path and application process led to limited agency coordination, and generally the council didn't understand what the overall funding need was throughout the state and what specific projects needed funding. So the goal of this new funding process is to encourage that proactive infrastructure planning through those state agencies and through other entities throughout the state. The hope is to enhance the coordination between these relevant agencies you see listed on the screen, and then have a comprehensive list of prioritized water infrastructure projects, because we can't allocate funds if we don't understand understand the entire need that is also prioritized. And then the end hope is to increase transparency and efficiency in the water funding process. So the state legislature got to work in 2024 and created House Bill 280. As you can see on the timeline, there are many items from this bill, including reports and studies and various actions that the council, the Water Development Coordinating Council, has to achieve. The House Bill 280 also established the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan, which is what we're talking about during this presentation, and the Water Infrastructure Fund. And so we'll talk about both of these items. As you can see on this timeline, we are in the middle of November. So the most previous report that was just completed was the fee study at the end of October. And then the next major action, or major item, is the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan, will be adopted by the council on March 1st of 2026. So I've mentioned this plan, but what are the overall goals or objectives of it? It's essentially to aid the understanding of water infrastructure needs throughout the state and create a better coordination between those major funding agencies I mentioned. We want to have proactive planning, which will include a plan of 20 years out with individual timelines of 2, 5, and 10 years for projects to select from. And then we want to have a process to prioritize these projects. And then finally, the hope is that the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan will align with the state water policies and goals and recommendations. So where are we at in the process currently? In the spring of 2025, we had an initial project submission period and outreach campaign, where we emailed entities and notified them that if they are requesting state funding, they should get in this portal, as this is the new process. And we presented at various councils as well. Then on June 30th, one of the legislatively mandated dates, each agency, the divisions of water quality, water resources, and drinking water, adopted relevant agency plans. These plans will inform the overall unified plan that is adopted in March. And then from October 14th to November 14th, we held 4 meetings across the state to gather public input on the data prioritization process. We accepted public comments and questions until November 14th, just last week. And like I mentioned, this fee study was completed on October 31st, which is another mandated date by the House Bill 280. This fee study was essential for this process. It was essentially, if the UWIP is determining what is the need, how many projects, the fee study is looking at, okay, we see this gap in funding, and how can we collect more revenue to assist in funding these projects? And then November 19th, that is today, we are currently hoping that the UWIP data that we collected in the spring will be incorporated into the Utah project portal. This portal we will talk about a little bit more when we get into the funding process, or the prioritization process. So this map shows some of the initial data that we collected in the spring of 2025. It was a pretty short project submission period, only about a month, but we were pleasantly surprised to see the geographic distribution and various types of projects that submitted to the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan. Overall, total projects was around 3,600 from 255 different entities. And the estimated total project cost for that 20-plus year timeline is just under 18 billion. And then one of the questions we asked was, how much state funding are you expecting right now in your current project definition? And this was just under 6 billion. So this gets into the draft UWIP prioritization process. This process is broken up into 3 phases. The first phase is called the provisional scoring. The second phase is the relevant agency ranking. And the third phase is the funding prioritization. So the first phase, provisional scoring, the purpose is to identify the project's readiness and recommend projects for further application and consideration. And we'll go over each of these individual steps. So like I had mentioned, the Utah Project Portal we've been working with the Governor's Office of Budget and Planning and Region 6, who developed this website with the goals of having a platform to plan for a variety of different project types, which could include projects that aren't related to water. But we saw some alignment with the UWIP's goals, and so we partnered with them to incorporate the UWIP data into the Utah Project Portal. So moving forwards, the goal is that entities or anyone expecting state funding can enter and manage their project data within this portal. People will be able to create an account, log on, and manage across all different project types. So if you're a city and you have drinking water needs, wastewater needs, or even other utility needs, you can plan it all in one location. And then the hope is that this will be the centralized portal that will have a cutoff date for these annual agency plans and this Unified Water Infrastructure Plan, where the agencies can collect the data, export it, and work through this process and create a plan to help with their funding needs. So the second step of this first phase is scoring all of these projects against each other. And this is pretty difficult to do because we know that different project types have various different aspects to them. So we tried to keep these initial criteria pretty generalized. And from House Bill 280 explicitly listed different criteria that are required to be included in this process, which is where these came from. So the first one is hardship, and this measures to what degree a project represents an economic hardship. This criteria looks at the median adjusted gross income and compares it to the state to gather an initial understanding of where an area may have economic hardship. And then critical issue. This criteria measures to what degree a project addresses a critical need, such as the protection of public health, safety, or compliance with a state or federal water quality standard. Then water efficiency. This is to what degree does a project increase water conservation or the efficient use of water. And sound design. This is how far along in the design process is a project developed. And then we also wanted to include a criteria that allows the entity to assign priority for their individual projects. This will encourage the entity to prioritize their needs within a certain project type. And then finally, the last criteria is population benefited and non-state funding. This criteria is an attempt to balance small system needs with larger systems. We understand that small systems may not have all the resources that large systems do, so we wanted to give an opportunity and balance those needs with this criteria. Finally, the last step of phase 1 is assigning all the different infrastructure types to the lead agency. As you can see, these are the different infrastructure types we asked for water: agriculture off-farm, secondary, water supply, raw water source development, drinking water, reuse, stormwater flood control, wastewater, and then finally water supply, watershed protection. So that moves us into phase 2 of relevant agency ranking. This is a pretty crucial step, where phase 1 is that initial high-level analysis for all the projects 20 years out. Phase 2 is the more low-level, in-depth analysis of each projects that are more ready to actually move through and get funding for their projects. And then, as an example, we walk through the current water resources funding process. It is broken down into 3 phases. You have the first step, or steps. The applicant applies for funding through the agency, and then the second step is authorization, and the third step is committal of funds. So how would the UWIP process fit into this existing process? So UWIP is technically this pre-application step. It's where the projects submit to this portal, they plan 20 years out, and then the projects get this provisional score ranking. And just to be, it's kind of a requirement to go to that next step of application, is you must be within the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan. And then the next step is authorization, would act as that phase 2 relevant agency ranking. This gives the agencies the opportunity to meet with the applicant, gather more information, adjust the ranking as needed based on information that comes to light during the meeting with the applicant. And then this feasibility report, typically in the past, has just made recommendations for loans and the loan terms and interest rate to the Board of Water Resources. But additionally, if there's more money in the Water Infrastructure Fund, this could potentially be grants. So this feasibility report would look at the grant availability in addition to the loans. And then currently, as of now, the Board of Water Resources may add conditions to the applicant that they must complete before funds can be committed. And this is the step that the Water Development Coordinating Council will ensure that their criteria are also met. So that moves us into phase 3, the Water Development Coordinating Council funding prioritization, and the various criteria that this council could determine to prioritize and distribute funding. And then these criteria will allow the State Council to make requests to the Utah legislature for funding needs. So these are a few of the proposed criteria that the council could use to determine that funding request to the state legislature. We understand that some of these criteria don't apply for all different project types, but this is an attempt to determine projects that are ready for funding and ensure that customers and projects are charging adequate and sustainable rates, which applies to that first criteria of usage rates greater than or equal to 1.5% of the MAGI, median adjusted gross income. We want to make sure entities are planning and can utilize their self funds to fund their projects and then utilize state funds in addition to that. And like I mentioned before, there is a provisional score for the UWIP, and the council could determine that they will set a threshold for what kind of score that they will fund to, and that could determine a certain number of projects or a certain magnitude of money that the projects are requesting. And then, as I mentioned, if the Water Infrastructure Fund is funded, it could potentially be distributed as grants, and the criteria of maximum grant funding limitations is to ensure that large and costly projects are not taking up most of the grant funding. Then finally, one of the requirements from House Bill 285 is that an entity who receives water infrastructure funds has a capital asset management plan in place. So just circling back to one of those items that was completed, so that completes the prioritization process. But just to touch on the fee study, which is another item that was mandated from House Bill 280 and completed on October 31st of 2025. This study looked at how the current funding capacity compares to what that gap is in funding. How much additional funds do we need if we're going to fund all these projects that we have identified across the state? It looks at if a user fee and/or tax is necessary to provide additional state funds, and gives the state legislature policy options to explore. This fee study is actually getting presented to a few committees and councils this week, and currently there are no statutes or anything in place for a fee. That is up to the state legislature if they will move forward with that. So the next steps are the division or the council will be filing administrative rules relating to this process this fall. And as I mentioned, the Utah Project Portal should be open today for additional projects and account creations. And then we will export this data at the end of September to include in our March 1st of 2026 Unified Water Infrastructure Plan. Any data that is added after or at the start of January will be included in the upcoming plans past that March 1st date. Then a draft version of the UWIP will be sent to the Utah Watersheds Council for review. And the next meeting for this is on January 12th of 2026. The Utah Watersheds Council will can give any comments or feedback on the proposed process. And then the Water Development Coordinating Council will adopt the UWIP on March 1st of 2026. One of the goals of this plan is to help inform how much money is needed, and so this will help the legislature appropriate any monies or make any decisions in that 2026 general session. So just some final takeaways for the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan. The hope is that this is a proactive planning document that encourages collaboration between the state agencies and any entity needing state funds. And in the end, we'd hope that this funding will increase efficiency and transparency throughout the state. And thank you. Are there any questions?
Hello. I don't think this is exactly in your arena, but one of the things that comes up frequently is that part of our difficulty with conservation has historically been the fact that some of the water fees are buried in property tax. And is there any thought or thing that you can discuss about increasing transparency and that source of funding that seems to be challenging?
I will defer this question to Keith Larson.
So the goal here was not specifically to address that issue. I think you're referring to, are we paying for water via property tax or rates? However, the recent fee study that has been issued does include discussion of both of those issues, and so I would encourage those who are interested to get involved in feedback on that study. Both of those options have been explored, and I will just note that current discussions focus more on a user fee, which would tie to the use of water, where it's specifically water. But those are still being discussed and being considered by the legislature.
So if one wanted to be involved, where is the point of involvement?
Relative to the fee study, We just had on the UWIP, our comment period just closed. Eric, do you know on the fee study, do we have? So what I would do, you can definitely go to the UWIP site, and that will lead you to the fee study to get more information. And then I would encourage you to talk to your legislators.
And the comment period just closed.
The comment period on the prioritization process just closed.
Thank you.
The only other thing that I would mention to this group is that the Unified Water Infrastructure Plan does include a component for watershed protection. So I think a lot of people are focusing on water and wastewater type projects, but for this group in particular, that watershed protection component is funded or potentially funded through the plan. And so your projects that need state funding are potentially eligible through this infrastructure plan.
Thank you for the information that you've given us. My question is, when you were setting up this process, did you consider things that could go wrong at each step and how you would mitigate that?
There's definitely some difficulty with the provisional scoring criteria. And we understood that, and that's kind of where the importance falls on that relevant agency ranking phase, when you actually get a staff member from one of the agencies to meet with the applicant and have the ability to adjust the score after you gain more project definition through that meeting. There were some comments during that question and comment period that people were concerned that the project list is inflated because this is a wish list or something, and we'd want to state that that is a possibility. But when we were doing this initial project campaign, we wanted to encourage projects that even if they didn't know that they were wanting state funding right now, that they could enter their projects with 0% state funding or adjust or edit the percentage later. So that's just a specific example of something that came up throughout this process, but we're hoping to address any concerns as we move throughout the process development.
My name is Dan Potts. I'm with the Salt Lake Fish and Game nonprofit. So my question is, what about the value in terms of ranking? What about the value of partnerships? It seems like if you get the whole community behind you and all these other, valuable entities participating, that the ranking should be higher. So could you address the ranking as relative to the value of partnerships?
One of the criteria that population benefited in non-state funding, it gives more of a weight to projects that have other funding sources, which right now that is kind of generalized. We aren't asking specifically what kind of partnerships and giving higher rankings for other partnerships, but if an entity is coming to us and they have a diverse profile and they're only requesting a small amount of state funds, they do get a higher point in that provisional score. And we do encourage collaboration. That's kind of the whole goal of this process, is to increase coordination through all those agencies within the state council, and of course encourage entities to collaborate with local.
Let me add just one last thought on that. The comment period for the prioritization process has closed. However, we are still in the process of developing rules, and there will be separate hearings and opportunity to comment on the actual rules that come out of this. And so this type of comment would be an excellent to submit during the rule making process to further emphasize collaboration. I do think we've captured some of that, but these types of comments are great as we develop these rules. One last?
Thank you. My question is, how is this process informed by water availability and future climate models for water in the state?
So the goal of this process is not necessarily to address those specific issues. I think the importance of this process is to put in a framework that will allow us to fund the solutions that we need to address those bigger policy issues. So I've had a few people say, oh, well, okay, this is water development. You're just trying to get more money to develop more water. And I don't see it that way at all. I see this as a way to have a system in place that will allow us to fund those solutions. And those solutions are going to include all kinds of good ideas that are developed by policymakers and interested parties like are here today to come up with good solutions for the state in the future.